Okay, it's just after 5, so I think, well, 5 here, 4 o'clock in London. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Hi, welcome to the session that is looking at alternative forms of protection in Africa. And I'm delighted to be here with you today and with a stellar group of speakers with whom we're going to be having a conversation. I know that it's towards the end of what for some of you has been a long day, so I'm hoping that we can energize and make use of the chat function to have a conversation with ourselves and with each other, and really see how we can learn from the different contexts that our speakers are going to be presenting on today. For those of you I've not met before, I'm Jo Joviri. I'm Director of the African Centre for Migration and Society at Wits University in South Africa. And I also wanted to acknowledge the Protect project that we are a partner and South African research partner in, which is looking at different forms of protection and the ways in which, in particular, the Global Compact for refugees is or isn't supporting legislative responses as well as de facto governance. So I'm delighted to be here with you today. We have 4 talks, 4 presentations, and I'll introduce the speakers as we go. But just to give you an idea, we have some inputs looking at the context of South Africa, both from Johannesburg and Cape Town. We have colleagues who are going to be sharing with us the experiences of South Sudanese refugees and community schools in Cairo, so colleagues who are based at the American University in Cairo, as well as reflections from Tanzania, where we're going to be looking at issues around protracted refugee situations in Tanzania and looking at mobility and connectivity as potential solutions to protracted situations. So we're really looking here to be looking at sort of these different contexts, and I'm hoping we can look at some similarities, we can look at differences, and we can see what wider lessons we might want to be applying in the work in which we're all involved in. I've unfortunately been unable to join for most of the conference, but from the sessions that I've been able to engage with, I think there's been some really interesting questions raised around the ways in which we do research, the role of research, and the ways in which we should be kind of communicating and applying our work. And I know that all the speakers here, this is also something they think about in their own work. So I'd really encourage you to also reflect on that. So not only the empirical side of things, but also really thinking about methodology and the ways in which we are all conducting research within this field. So I'm going to first hand over to Knowledge Mabena, who is a Zimbabwean academic. He has recently completed his master's degree with us at the ACMS, a master's in migration and displacement. So I'm delighted that Knowledge is going to be here to share some of his research. And his work really does look at the intersections between governance, identity politics, decolonization of knowledge, politics of bordering, public health, education, cultural institutions, and knowledge production. So a wonderful interdisciplinary approach to looking at issues around migration and displacement and protection. So Knowledge, I'll hand over to you, and you've got your 10 minutes just starting now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Jo, for such a great and wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for this opportunity to present my research. And basically, my research focused on how, when faced with different challenges or obstacles of accessing justice, migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees tend to devise certain strategies, to navigate those obstacles. And it's quite interesting to see how different urban spaces, offer, different challenges or opportunities to these migrants. So perhaps to just kickstart this discussion, let me point to the most important terms that we tend to perhaps overlook at some point. when you do our research. And my term was the one that I focused on really was in terms of how to migrants deploy or seekers deploy their agents, So arguing that in most literature, we've seen that migrants have truly been presented as, vulnerable, but in my research, I saw human beings who come up with strategies, to navigate different obstacles or to access to justice. Okay, move to the next slide, Joe. Okay, so in terms of framing my research, I use different theories just to tap into the different perspectives about how migration or migrants tend to perform in different social fields. So my research has been framed around those multiple theories. Okay, so in terms of methodology, I deployed qualitative research, and it was kind of a quasi-ethnographic approach where I usually took advantage of in-depth interviews and participant observation, and being a migrant myself, used my personal experience. And so from now on, I decided then to come up with most important themes that came out of, which themes that I think are important that came out from the research. So I think we can move please to another slide. Okay, so the interviews that I did, or the research together with the literature review that I did, it came out that Johannesburg urban spaces, they tend to present different challenges, as I've mentioned, and opportunities for migrants. And so, they deal with various actors, but in particular here has been the police and the Home Affairs Department. And literature has shown that the Home Affairs Department has been, and the police have been, termed as corrupt and very slow in terms of when dealing with migrants or migrant issues. So the other finding was that as Landau writes in Fremantle, that cities should be understood and treated as archipelagos of belonging. So in other words, every urban space that migrants are presented, they tend to negotiate their identities, perhaps in terms of language, in terms of who they are, in terms of what spaces they, tend to occupy, perhaps as informal migrants, as informal traders, or as workers, domestic workers, and also. So each and every space tends to shape how one develops their identity and really exert their skills of belonging. So so we tend to see migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers developing or fracturing their identities just to occupy certain spaces. So the other thing that came out was just language. For example, people who came from Zimbabwe who could actually converse in Tswana, can converse in Zulu, which has a close proximity to the South African languages. So they tend to deal with the Home Affairs using such a language, and they tend to deal with the police using such a language. Okay. So despite all these challenges that migrants face in these different urban spaces, they tend to deploy their agency, in negotiating different spaces, and developing these survival strategies, of which they survive by any means. If it means bribing the police, it means bribing the Home Affairs officials, it's widely written that they do that. And most important is how we have these different writings of which migrants have been presented as vulnerable all the time. But from this research, it came out clearly that they tend to be strong in certain areas and really assert themselves to deal with different urban spaces. We can maybe move on to another slide. Okay, so what I've been saying here speaks more to migrants' ingenuity, to migrants' ability to use their agency to devise strategies to perform, kind of much more performed survival within Johannesburg. So what they do in public differs from what they do in private settings. or what they do when they're in a certain group where they feel comfortable is different from what they do when they're encountered with different spaces that are kind of not friendly at all. And during the writing of this is at the end of my analysis. We saw the development of a group called Operation Tutula, which is a more violent group towards migrants, and it comes as xenophobic and as we have seen recently again, particularly those who manage to use our resources like Zeno, which will see that they've been, mobilizations against foreigners. For example, recently the oval markets, that's foreign dominated, it's been banned in the past, I think it was 2 weeks ago. So these are the challenges that refugees are facing and migrants are facing in South Africa. But even so, they tend to develop different strategies, to encounter or to deal with these various encounters. So I think I'll stop there, Joe.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Knowledge, and thanks for keeping to time. You actually had 3 minutes left, so I'm pleased that that's going to give us chance for more conversation, which is great. And just some thoughts as we're about to move on to the next talk, obviously. But the idea of this sort of identity switching, I think is something that it would be great to come back to in the discussion, and really using that to sort of think about the ways in which the city is seen as a resource, both in the short term and potentially in the long term, and the sort of narratives and trajectories that the migrants that you were engaging with, how did they see the city in the future? Did they see it as a resource that could kind of, manifest over longer periods of time? It would be great if we could come back to that for the discussion. And if others who are listening online have any thoughts on that, it'd be great to hear from you, particularly if this is something in your own work that has emerged, and this idea of kind of performative, extra legal identity switching, and the ways in which we know that strategies and tactics, if we want to use that language, can be used times where we might want to be seen as visible to the state, for example, and others, and times where we need to switch that identity to remain out of sight in certain ways. And so, I'd be, really welcome thoughts on that. So we're now going to move over to colleagues who are going to be presenting and sharing experiences on work that they have done in the context of Cairo. And so we have Amira Hetaba Sabri, whose research focuses on international refugee law and also entitlements that refugees hold in Egypt. And we have her colleague as well. It's Alina Habersky, who is current project manager of the Egyptian Migration Hub. And maybe if we have time in the discussion, it would be great to hear a bit more from both of you about the hub and the network, and what its role is, and successes and challenges that perhaps have come up with that. And Elena's work focuses on migrant rights, and also the important conversation around the ways in which the European Union is sort of externalizing borders to Egypt, and thinking about deportation and the contestation of borders in global South context more broadly. So thank you, and over to Amira and Elena, and you also have your 10 minutes, so thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I think our pictures got switched, so this was interesting for me and Elena now, but yes, thank you for the introduction. As you've already mentioned, our research is focused on the South Sudanese refugee communities in Cairo and their special way they found to access education through establishing their own community schools. I'll give you a short overview over the situation in Egypt, what rights refugees have with regard to education and how these community schools fit within this framework. And then Elena will give you a deeper insight into the personal experiences of the South Sudanese refugee families and also the community school teachers in their daily life in Cairo. So just some introductory words at the beginning of our presentation. The legal research with regard to the right to education heavily draws on our work, like Elena's and my work at the Center for Migration Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo, where I was a research officer at a project on refugee entitlements in Egypt funded by the European Union, and Elena was our project manager. And during this project, we conducted detailed legal research, not just in education, but different entitlements refugees and asylum seekers have or should have in Egypt, and also conducted focus group discussions with refugee communities. And the results were published in a comprehensive report by the center. I think Elena shared the link in case anybody is interested in reading more on the situation in Egypt. But now just on this particular research, Joe, if you could please get to the next slide. So the situation for refugees in Egypt basically looks as follows. So Egypt is state party to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which states that refugees are entitled to enjoy the same treatment as nationals in accessing primary education and are to be treated no less favorably than foreigners in general with regard to secondary and higher education. So based on this, South Sudanese asylum seekers and refugees should have the right to send their children to Egyptian public primary schools under the same conditions as Egyptian children. However, Egypt entered a reservation on this provision and stated that they retain the right to grant this kind of privilege on a case-by-case basis. While this kind of reservation is valid with regard to secondary and higher education, there are other international human rights treaties in place that clearly state that the right to access free primary education cannot be limited like this. For example, Egypt is party to the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, and also on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which gives all children access to free primary education. However, in practice, we've found that Egypt, unfortunately, does not fully implement this right. So as you can see on the next slide, the Egyptian law here is very particular. It states that generally foreigners may not attend public schools and they can only attend private schools. So the reason behind this law was probably to fight the overcrowdedness of the public schools and reserve the limited spaces they have for education for the Egyptian children as a priority. And only later there were some exceptions made for certain nationalities who may still attend public schools, but at a higher fee than nationals. So, and among these special nationalities are also Sudanese. So this leaves us with the particular situation in practice that Sudanese children should be allowed to access those public primary schools, even if at a higher fee. Next slide, please, Joe. But there are still problems that they face. So not all public schools actually accept South Sudanese because the law only talks about Sudanese. There was no clarification made on like what is the situation for South Sudanese since they got their own state. Also, the registration process in practice is very difficult and full of problems when school officials often do not accept UNHCR cards as valid identification, or they require documents that refugees just cannot provide, old school records, other information they cannot present to the school officials. Also, the tuition fees, as mentioned, are higher than the national ones, so it's not free access, which makes it also difficult. And even if families manage to enroll their children in those public primary schools in Egypt, there's still a big problem of incidents of discrimination taking place within schools and also harassment there and on the way to school. So Elena and I have often heard about incidents where children got harassed, were even physically attacked by other children, often even grown-ups on their way to school, which makes it very unsafe for them to attend public school. And as the South Sudanese refugee communities find themselves in this very difficult situation and can't really find help from the state in that regard, they have established their own way of dealing with this by creating community schools as a safe space to educate their children. So what do these community schools look like? Next slide, please, Jill. Thank you. So community schools are not per se schools as we know them. They're usually operating from within apartments. They're very small. They're unofficial institutions. And there's hardly enough space for all students, so they often take shifts in during their lessons. Like some students come in the morning, some in the afternoon. Surprisingly, we found in our research that they have a high level of structure, like they are working together with the South Sudanese embassy and follow their curriculum. They offer official exams. But the main problem is that they're not accepted by the Egyptian authorities. They're unofficial. So any certificates they issue are not acknowledged by Egyptian schools. There is also no centralized quality control, in the meaning of that not all teachers are qualified to teach, and there's nobody there to ensure that the school's level is the same in all different community schools. Of course, also operating from small apartments is not an ideal learning environment for children. And the schools depend on financial support and donations to actually operate, which makes it very difficult for them. But despite all these problems, community schools, most importantly, offer a safe space for children to learn and to receive necessary education. And Elena actually visited some community schools and talked with the students, teachers there, and she can give you a much better insight on how the families experience the community schools.
Okay, thank you so much, Amira. Joe, if you could please go to the next slide. And greetings from a very hot Cairo. So as Amira has mentioned, it was amazing to have such an astute legal researcher on the project for this part, because the foundation of what we know about the law really came from the work Amira and my former colleague Claire did. So what my job was to really go out into the communities and find out what their personal experiences were within things that we had heard from the focus group discussions from the Refugee Entitlements Project. So one thing that we decided to do, because of all of the issues we had heard about the community schools, is to actually visit them. So I went into Ain Shams, and Ain Shams is an area of Cairo which is considered to be more working class. We would probably now consider it, with inflation, to be lower to lower middle class neighborhood of Egyptians. But this also means that commodities are cheaper. So many refugee communities also find homes in communities like these because they're able to afford rent and groceries and other personal belongings. So there is a large South Sudanese community within Ain Shams. So this is the community schools that we decided to visit. As Amir had mentioned, the schools I had been to are in average apartment buildings. So there are a few floors and they're turned into a makeshift school. So usually the schools will rent like 2 or 3 floors. One floor will be kind of the administration, and then the other 2 floors will be classrooms, usually 1 floor for primary and the top floor for secondary schools. But as Amira has mentioned, this brings up issues of quality control. The government is concerned, for example, what happens if there is a fire or some other natural disaster? Will there be an escape plan for the children to leave? But also there are harassment and complaints from neighbors in general, saying that the school is making too much noise and the students are being too loud, and this is a residential area and they don't have their correct permits, which is true because they are not registered, as Amira has mentioned. So before we go into the positives about how community schools really give protection, which is the theme of this panel discussion, I just want to raise again the issues that these community schools are facing. Obviously, being able to pay rent for the multiple rooms or floors that they have taken over, including electricity bills. When I visited, it was the end of September, beginning of October, so it's still very hot in Cairo, and there was 1 fan working, but there was no air conditioning because they can't afford it. So you can imagine heat rises are on the top floors of these buildings, so it's already very hot. Trying to pay teacher salaries and also training for teachers, as Amir had said, not all these teachers are trained in education. Some are. Some have been teachers, perhaps in South Sudan, but many aren't. They're educated. They have maybe a bachelor's degree or even a master's degree, but they've never been trained in pedagogy or other educational backgrounds, which is something they're aware of, and it's something they want, but they're unable to get because of the funding and resources available. As Amir has mentioned, also harassment, unfortunately, to and from school was something the students told me was a huge issue, especially for the girls. Even walking like the 15 minutes maybe, or 5, 10, depending on where they live. To give you again an idea, there are different community schools even within one neighborhood. So children don't have to go as far as they would if there was only one or two. But even still, the route to and from school is often fraught with harassment and bullying. Of course, the boys also told me that they experience bullying, but not as much as the girls. So they try and walk in groups, but sometimes if someone is sick or unavailable to go, it poses problems. Again, as I mentioned, upset neighbors, that these schools are taking place in residential areas. And of course, there's no school security because there's no resources to pay security. So one administrator actually had told me that one time a neighbor came in with a knife and threatens the principal because of the noise. And they were able to diffuse the situation, but then they started locking the door and having at least a community member at the door to let people in to make sure that they were safe. Next slide. And it's our last slide. However, as Amira said, the school itself is seen as a safe haven away from the prying eyes and harassments of the streets. So we're talking about the school itself. Many, the theories that the students had told me, and the themes, that the students had told me over and over and over again. I did about 20 or 30 interviews. They have community, they have fellowship, and also they're actually learning something. So they say either most of them will actually want to go back to South Sudan. So when they go back home, that they can contribute to their community. But for those who maybe don't think they can go back home or don't want to, at least they can contribute something positive to their host community. Also, I spoke with about 15 parents as well as students, and the parents believe that having a community school built a network of safety, not only for them as parents to worry less about their children, because many of the parents have to work informally outside, but also for their children to be with their own community and their own culture and their own languages. There's also an environment of solidarity, not only between the students and the teachers, but the administrators and the parents. So this is really something positive that the community school environment has really brought within Cairo, and has really been started from the ground up by the communities themselves, offering an alternative form of protection. I believe that is it. I think we almost stayed within the 10 minutes. So thank you, and we look forward to your questions and comments after.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amira and Elena, and thanks for you just ran over, but I will let it go. You did a great job. Thanks. And a very interesting piece of work, and I think also reflecting, as you mentioned, sort of the link between having a legal scholar with somebody doing more applied social research. And I think it's a really good example of the ways in which we can gain different insights, and that kind of collaborative approach, and the ways in which applying the analysis of the law to more kind of experiences on the ground and in the field is really welcome. So thanks for that. One of the things that I was thinking when you were speaking was about the fact that these schools, therefore, are actually quite visible, which I think is quite interesting, particularly when we think about, for example, some of Knowledge's inputs around sort of the times at which people perhaps shift identity to be more visible or less visible. Whereas it seems to me that these schools are very visible within the community, and that's something that might be interesting to come back to in the discussion. And the other thing is about, this question of, where we've got community organizing to take up some responsibilities of the state. And the question of what does that mean then in terms of holding the state responsible? And we've seen similar kind of challenges in the South African context, obviously elsewhere. But what does it mean when we see these very active, approaches that are about positive engagement and indicate very clearly how for this community, and we see this elsewhere, obviously, there is a real kind of drive to be involved in engaging and providing services within community and to their children, for example, in this case. But what does that mean when it's sort of in contradiction, perhaps, to the lack of positive application of legal frameworks and so forth? So I think that would be great if we could also come back to that perhaps in the discussion. So thank you both very much. We're now going to move over to Jane Marie Ruhundwa, who is a lawyer born and raised in Tanzania. And J-Marie is bringing to us some different perspectives that also link to the work that she's been involved in and the organization Dignity Kwanza, of which she's executive director. And this is the only national NGO in Tanzania that focuses on refugee rights. She is also lead of the local engagement Refugee Research Network Tanzania geographical working group. So I'm going to hand over now to J-Marie. I believe you've got your slides, so I will stop sharing and hand over to you now.
Thank you, Jo. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would also like to thank Professor Nick for organizing this panel and having me. I will not go into the introductions. We'll quickly talk about the study. So this study is part of the Horizon 2020 project called Transnational Figuration of Displacement, which was exploring mobility and connectivity as solutions to protracted refugee situations. So in Tanzania, we examined various coping mechanisms that urban refugees employ to navigate their lives in Dar es Salaam. So through, we used a qualitative approach, and we had in-depth interview with about 43 urban refugees and some focus group discussions as well. And before I go into the findings of the study, I would like to quickly share some facts about Tanzania. One, Tanzania has a strict encampment policy where all refugees are required to live in established camps, and the law makes it an offense for refugees to reside out of camps without permits. And these permits are usually given for medical and third reasons, and very rarely for other reasons like employment or business. And despite curtailing freedom of movement by this strict encampment policy, livelihoods activities unfortunately prohibited in refugee camps. And the last fact is that UNHCR records less than 200 urban refugees in Dar es Salaam, but there's a 2012 study which suggests that there could be over 10,000 undocumented urban refugees in Dar es Salaam. So I wanted to start with that background. Our study found that many urban refugees are outside of the protection system simply because they are undocumented. They live in Dar es Salaam without permits. So that's was kind of expected. And as such, they cannot access many services. For example, they cannot enroll their children in public schools, and private schools are very expensive for them. They cannot register their businesses or open bank accounts or even register SIM cards. They cannot access many services that require IDs. The study also found that networking and mobility have been essential to afford these urban refugees protection. So the participants of the study show that although they have to live in hiding in order to avoid arrest and deportation or being sent back to camps, they manage to identify places such as churches or NGOs supporting refugees, like Dignity Kwanza, where they can safely visit and engage in activities that are taking place there. But they're also able to identify individuals within the communities, within the host community, with whom they can freely and safely network and collaborate. So they try as much as possible to maintain their networks of friends and relatives within the city, but also back home in their countries of origin, in refugee camps, and also in abroad. They also try to be of good behavior and always try to have something to offer, like skills, and they tend to be overly friendly because that's how they can make friends from within the host community. They try to also blend in by trying to speak well the Tanzanian Swahili, which is a bit different from the Swahili spoken in Congo, where majority of the people we spoke with come from. And this is important for them so that they are able to hide the fact that they are refugees. And they also very good at taking advantage of technological advancement to network and do businesses. Most of them were doing their businesses through social media. So through these networks, they are able to access services. They're able to, some share that they have enrolled their children to school by using names of their Tanzanian friends. They will make children as members of the families of their Tanzanian friends. They have their friends or neighbors register their SIM cards, which enable them to stay in touch with their other relatives, or also do their livelihoods activities. So I'd like to share a story of one lady that we spoke with, Hazina. It's not her real name. So Hazina fled Eastern Congo when she was only 17, and they arrived in Tanzania with her brother, her younger brother. Her parents were killed in Congo, and the other two siblings were separated, and they don't know their whereabouts to date. Because of asylum regime challenges, she was not able to be registered as a refugee. So she stayed in Dar es Salaam as an undocumented refugee. She was surviving by working as a mobile hairdresser. So she would post different hairstyles on social media, and those interested would reach out to her, and she would meet them and plait their hair. With the support of Dignity Kwanza and my NGO, the NGO I'm working with, she was able to reestablish contacts with her uncle, who they found out that is in Austria. So they separated with this, the uncle left them in Congo. She was, unfortunately, she was unable to reunite with her uncle in Austria because she's not a registered refugee. But her uncle sent her some money that she used to open her hairdressing salon. But again, because she's undocumented, she could not register her salon. So she informally partnered with one of her trusted clients, who is also a Tanzania local star. So this client registered the business in her name, and Hazina poses as a mere employee of the business. So this is a win-win situation for both Hazina and the Tanzania local star, because the star enjoys the prestige of owning a salon business, while Hazina is able to put her skills in use and earn a living. So the salon business has employed several Tanzanians, and through it, Hazina is able to pay for her accommodation, but also pay for her brother's music lessons. So another finding was that the perspective of host community members who interact with refugees is way different from the general perspective that refugees are threat to security, or would create competition on the meager resources. So these are host community members who interact with refugees, live with them. They see them as business partners or friends, or even people who need assistance. So it's through this study that we learned the term Good Samaritan, that some Tanzanians or some refugees would say, a Tanzanian who is a good Samaritan helped me with accommodation for some days, helped me to get a job, and so on and so forth. We also learned that these alternative forms of protection are not without challenges. So some participants of the study have reported instances where their Tanzanians partners or supporters have taken advantage of them. One participant shared that she would be sent to do work for the church pastor who had offered her accommodation, but he would not pay her for the work she does. And the Hazina, in the example I gave, is facing difficulties in managing other staff of the salon because they do not respect her. They think she's just their fellow employee. And since some of them suspect that she's a Congolese, she cannot be too tough on them because she fears they may call immigration officers on her. So there's also the question of identity, where in cases where refugee children have to attend school in family names of which are not theirs. So in conclusion, we found that urban refugees and their hosts have gone a step ahead to find ways to fill in the protection gap. However, although they managed to cope, still solutions, more permanent and sustainable solutions should be found for them in order to avoid negative impact of prolonged marginalization and invisibility that they are in. And also other challenges such as risk of statelessness in case of identities of the children, but also child rights violations and even possible human trafficking. And the protection regime in the country should learn from these experiences and also try to create policies and laws that offers more protection. So I'll end there. I'm not so sure how I'm doing with time, but I'll be happy to get questions from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane Marie, and thanks again. Yet another perfect. You were exactly on 10 minutes, so so thank you so much for that. And thanks for sharing the research that you're doing. I think that what would be, something also, that's come up again is this idea of finding ways that to sort of fill the gap of the state, and the initiatives that are taken to try and find ways to find different ways of living and being in spite of sort of the lack of support and engagement. And this idea of safe spaces being kind of discovered, and the importance of networks, including transnational networks, those back at home, those back in the camp, as well as those where people have traveled further afield. And it would be interesting maybe to come back to that, to think about sort of continued mobility, and how much you mentioned people moving between the city and the camps, for example. Are people moving more regularly? Is it something that is planned? Is it something that's more fluid? And at what point do people take those decisions? I also thought that something, it'd be great also, this idea of businesses being run via social media. And obviously that's something that we are kind of globally seeing more and more ways in which things are turning kind of digital in the ways in which people are living and working. And how that linked to what you were talking about people struggling to register SIM cards, for example, but that neighbors or other community members were registering SIM cards on their behalf. And it would also be good to hear a bit more about who those neighbors are, because as you mentioned, I think it was the story that you were sharing about the lady who's running her hair salon, and wanting to at the same time kind of be a bit under the radar. So what does it mean? Who is it that is supporting people to register SIM cards? Is it that these are communities where there is also a large population and an established community of, for example, Congolese? Is it that these are households or neighbors whereby people have, for example, married? There are cross-border transnational families and networks already. Is there something specific about that community as to where and why this sort of support comes in? Because it would be, we know that in other contexts very close by, there is more of a resistance to engaging and supporting refugee communities. So that might be something interesting to think about. And the ways in which all of this then comes together as these different forms of sort of responding to displacement, again, driven by individuals and their own networks in the absence of state support and responses. So thanks, Jane Marie. We are now going to move on to our final inputs, but absolutely not the last part of our discussion. And we are, sorry, I just opened the wrong, and we are now going to be, moving to hear from Tamuka Chekero, who is a PhD candidate at University of Cape Town, UCT, is an anthropologist. And Tamuka's doctoral research looks at how people who cross and recross national borders form relationships and make and maintain connections through conviviality within Southern Africa. And so Tamuka's work also looks at issues around security, gender equity, economic inclusion, and social cohesion. And so again, bringing quite a wide range of interests into his research. So Tamuka, you also have 10 minutes, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jo. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yes,
I must
you
say
are.
that.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I must say that, you know, I'm very new when it comes to refugee studies. It's something that I started, you know, during my PhD. Although it is not the main focus of my PhD, but something that I felt I should look at. So this study examines the ways in which the refugee category affects the ways in which refugees from African countries negotiate space in Belleville, South Africa. For those who don't know, Belleville is part of a greater Cape Town metropole, and it used to be the heart of the White Afrikaner Dome. It is also located 25 kilometers out of the city of Cape Town. So my study explores the way in which being a refugee produces and reinforces particular kinds of boundaries and borders that can limit the kind of mobility that one can exercise. So the data that I'm presenting here were drawn from an ethnographic work that I conducted between 2017 and 2020 as part of my broader doctoral research on mobility and sociality in the Africa's emerging urban. Also, this paper is anchored on the conceptual framework of conviviality, championed by Francis Nyamjo, and also the concept of social capital, championed by Robert Putnam. And all these two concepts, they embrace the notions of agency, social networks, and connections as invaluable adaptive capitals. So herein, I focus on the movement of refugees. Can you move to the next slide? Herein, I focus on the movement of refugees and its blockages within the city. So I focus on the intra-city movements, right? So many researchers have been focusing on the movement of refugees from their countries of origin, you know, into South Africa, or from town to town in South Africa. But my research is focusing on the movement within the city itself. And also it's looking at the blockages, and some of the blockages herein include the police roadblocks, lack of documentation, arrest and deportation, and lockdown regulation during the COVID-19 period, among other things. These, together with exclusion and other challenges that refugees suffer, are what I frame as borders and boundaries. While refugees are accommodated in the policy framework and the South African Constitution, their daily practices are impeded by social boundaries and borders. Refugees are rarely considered within the political agenda, and they are principally considered to be intruders rather than opportunities. The locals perceive them as responsible for precipitating urban social problems. So their everyday challenges in this case are seldomly addressed through formal institution structures. Rather, they addressed through haphazard and informal refugee social networks. So most of my participants that I worked with in this study are predominantly from countries that with war, conflicts, and other predicaments like natural disasters, such as floods, droughts, and famine. So due to these push factors, most of them identified themselves as refugees. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the key findings was that, you know, there are a lot of boundaries and borders that refugees face. The first one that I would like to talk about are documentations and roadblocks. So internal borders and boundaries have become a common feature of mobility in South African cities and small towns. So in understanding about internal boundaries and borders, roadblocks were very essential in this study. So the refugees that I worked with in this research felt that the South African Metro Police and the South African Police Services stage spontaneous roadblocks targeting mainly foreign nationals who do not have papers. Although legally the roadblocks are not spontaneous, usually they require a set of instruction from the above. Refugees feel that these roadblocks are unsolicited. Refugees feel that the police use personal discretion. That is, they judge according to their preconceived notions that, you know, refugees are poor, black, and always repatriating. So if they see a car that looks odd, then they think that it must be a refugee, it must be a migrant, then they stop it. In contrast, when the police stage roadblocks, the study discovered that the white people are occasionally stopped because they are viewed as tourists in Cape Town. On the other side, black people, depending on their status and belonging, are subject to rigorous scrutiny. So these irregularities and incompetence and the selective application of the law are what many participants say they are grappling with. So I also sought the side of the police with their experience with the refugees. So the police indicated that they feel that the social profiling that is being spoken of by the refugees is not the truth. During the conversation that I had with some of the police officers, they made it that their work and how they enforce the law has nothing to do with nationality, belonging or not belonging. The police confirmed that there's no selective application of the law, despite most of my participants insisting that they feel that there is selective application of the law based on belonging. Then from there, I think I moved on to look at lockdown regulations and curfew as borders. During the COVID-19 lockdown level 5 in South Africa, the government suspended movement, including that of Ubers, meter taxis, private cars, pedestrians during the curfew hours. Despite the Uber drivers being considered essential workers, they were not permitted to travel after curfew hours. Many refugee urban Uber drivers confirmed falling into arrears on the rent-to-own agreements on their cars. A handful of cars and vehicles were repossessed, and also some of the drivers were stopped from working because they were not making as much as they were making prior to COVID. So curfew and lockdown disrupted the movement of refugee Uber drivers, which is significant to their work. Moreover, they faced different regulations and challenges just like citizens. However, the outcome when they encounter the law enforcers would be different from that of the locals. Refugees felt that they would be more likely to receive heavy penalties compared to locals. This, of course, was not particularly surprising, considering the government mandated restrictions on movement and the financial struggles of other transport bodies such as the taxis. However, the migrants and these refugees, for them to negotiate their way through all these boundaries and borders, I think they adopted what I would like to frame as a nimble-footed approach. So because the refugees, they lack belonging, their survival is likely to be characterized by various kinds of borders and boundaries. So as a way of navigating and negotiating the city, they must know when, where, and how to move, and when not to make movements. In some cases, the study found that the refugees choose to be visible or invisible, to be mobile or not to be mobile. So refugees' visibility or invisibility, which means being in the right place with the right attitude, time, and with the right people, creates an opportunity to strategically maneuver in each situation. Navigating the city is an experience in which urban life, where one possesses or acquires experience and strategies that allow the urban space to be negotiated and borders to be circumvented or encountered in everyday life. So refugees have to make decisions about where to go and how to get there, including opting not to leave the house at certain times. Though thought needs to be put into resources and ways of moving. So it is very necessary for refugees to read the city to know how to move into it. So even though boundaries and borders might impede the mobility of refugees in Bellevue, refugees deploy creative and innovative strategies to either negotiate or circumvent boundaries and borders they meet. This shows that even if borders are present in human existence, they are permeable and porous, hence presenting them as non-permanent phenomena. In negotiating boundaries and borders, refugees possess a wide range of social networks, including transnational networks. So they invest in collective action, which is very important to negotiate exclusion from access to livelihood spaces, to opportunities, to entitlements, and also to navigate life in Belfort, or to just get by and get ahead. Refugees cultivate various types of networks, such as friendship networks, marital relations, among others. The cultivation of these networks is premised on what Nyamjo describes as conviviality. This is the pursuit of sameness and commonalities by bridging divides and facilitating interconnections. So the collective action affords refugees a position to detect borders and boundaries and plan to adapt and mitigate risks on the way. For example, when there are roadblocks targeting non-nationals, people always use their connections to communicate as well as to get information. Then can we move to the last slide? So in conclusion, there's an increasing inconsistency of the interpretation of the law in the understanding and its application on ground, which makes it difficult for refugees, especially from African countries, to access their rights. Even if they know their rights, in most times they are not able to access their rights just because they lack belonging. However, one interesting finding was that, you know, the minorities also suffer the same challenges similar to that of refugees and migrants. However, it is ostensibly worse for non-nationals, depending on their status and also on their belonging. So the minorities, probably, for example, the Tsonga people from Limpopo, they can suffer the same challenges like that of refugees. But however, the outcome is different whenever they meet the law enforcers or when they meet the locals because of their status and belonging. However, in surviving among refugees, the convergence of social networks and local institutions can be instrumental in navigating their experience of structural violence and exclusion. I think I'll just have to end here. Thank you very much for the time.
Super. Thank you so much, Tamuka, and again, thanks for keeping to time. It's been such a pleasure facilitating this. You've all done brilliantly. So thank you for sharing this. And I, you know, while you were speaking, and you came at the end to the language of structural violence, and something that, you know, I was thinking, you know, while you were speaking is, you know, your work is also touching not only on kind of the physicality of you know, borders and boundaries, but also borders and boundaries in relation to, for example, accessing social and economic rights, accessing legislative processes, and sort of the ways in which borders can become sort of invisible, but the bordering is much more than just the physical border. And I think that your work goes into that more, which I think would be interesting to sort of, you know, once again, it's coming back to the absence of the state in some ways, but then the very, very visible presence of the state in, for example, roadblocks and the ways in which policing takes place. So again, an example, if we look across the four inputs here, where we're seeing sort of the absence of the state and responses to it, but then other ways in which the state is incredibly visible and different responses to that, and the ways in which people are navigating and are reading the city, are being nimble-footed, and the idea of collective action around that. And I really appreciate that your work is looking at that movement within cities, as you say, too often in migration studies more broadly, but also when we're looking at issues around refugees, we tend to look at that cross-border movement and focus on that. And the importance of thinking about mobility within urban areas and within countries is absolutely critical. And I think several of you in your talks have also raised that as a key issue. So thank you for that. So we've now got just under 20 minutes for some questions and discussion. And what I'll do is I will just pop back up the slide where we can see everybody's name and their presentations, just to help all of us keep up with who's who. so if it works, what I'll do is I'll just go through to some of the questions that people have popped in the chat boxes, and please do continue to add that. So both the audience who've joined us as well as speakers. So I thought let's just start with, there was a question for knowledge, looking at, this idea of tactics and identity switching. Are they seen by the people you spoke to as primarily about survival, so kind of a survival mode? Or did you get a sense of long-term planning as well? Is this something where tactics and identity switching are seen as a long-term concern, a long-term approach? And just to add on to that, I mean, the question also of fatigue, and what that means, having to constantly go through this sort of switching and forms of living in the city. So knowledge, I wondered if we could just start with you. I'll give you a couple of minutes to respond.
Thank you, Joe. I hope I understood your question well. So, I mean, in my research, what came out clearly was, the permanent temporalities that migrants and asylum seekers are subjected to. So in terms of, for example, access to education, in terms, for example, access to housing, access to health, these are negotiated daily, So there's no permanence per se, but then these are reinvented as need arises. So that's why it came up. For example, I noticed, as Tamuka has also mentioned, it's resonating with my research to say, how do people move around urban areas, to negotiate, access to housing, to negotiate access to health and all that. So these are the tactics that people use, and they're never permanent, they are fluid, because people are always negotiating these new obstacles that always come up. For example, in one of my research, I spoke to one of the interviewees. Really, they do their shopping. This is an example. They do their shopping in Hillbrook, but they stay as far as on the side of Soweto. The idea being that they're trying to run away from a place where it's foreign concentrated. So these are strategies that are always negotiated. But as places get violent, for example, the Operation Pitola, we see a reverse migration now into the urban center of Johannesburg, where they tend to say, here we are with our people, so we can at least, mobilize in terms of networking, in terms of, power sharing and all that. So these strategies and tactics are never permanent, but they are fluid and flexible, responding to the needs, daily needs of migrants. I hope I responded perfectly.
Sorry, Joe, you're muted.
Thank you so much. Thanks. What I appreciated here is the language around permanent temporalities and the sort of ways in which strategies and tactics are fluid and in response to different situations. And there's quite a lot of work that's been done, looking at the language of daily stresses and the pressures and challenges and the kind of psychosocial impacts that this then has on well-being and people's experiences, and the ways in which stress manifests and plays out in different ways, and the language of exhaustion and how tiring it is for people to have to invest this much energy in finding ways to survive and live the city. Knowledge.
Yeah, maybe just to add on that, I think particularly when you're talking about the South African issue, as researchers, you should appreciate that South Africa is much more of a developing country, and the idea of access, is a challenge to everyone who lives within South Africa, both locals and foreigners. So it becomes more compounding for foreigners because they have to negotiate all these spaces, your documentation and all that. So we may talk of all these findings that we did, but the main built-in block should be to understand that the idea of access in South Africa is challenging everyone who lives within South Africa, regardless of what the constitutional promises are. So we really need to maybe think about developing such methodologies that are going to maybe there's such discourses that have been deployed so far. So yeah, I just wanted to add that too.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that. So I'm just going to move now to Elena and Amira and the work, your research that you've shared. I wonder, so there's a question here about has there been any outreach work between the community schools that you were discussing and the local host community? And I think, again, this is sort of coming back to this idea of where and who is taking responsibility for this. And there was a second question also to you that was asking about whether there's a framework for the children who are attending the community schools to later join public schools. And in a way, I think that might be part of the same kind of question. In South Africa, well, in Johannesburg, there's an example of the equivalent of sort of a community school. It's not quite, but a school for refugee children that's affiliated and attached to a formalized school. And so it's additional learning support, but again, it's sort of extra curricular in many ways, but it's linked into the public, well, in this case, it's a private school, but they're linked into the school. And so there's some interesting kind of relationships there, which, you know, I wondered if there was any similar examples in Cairo, for example. So over to you both, thanks.
Okay, thanks for the questions. I might start, and Elena, you might add your insights, I think. Yes, those two questions actually fit very well together. As far as we've seen in our research, there is no real cooperation between the community schools and the official government side, or like from our interviews with government officials or UNHCR, the community schools are not seen as a valid solution to the problem. They still see that the refugees and asylum seekers should rather be included in the public system. How this is done, however, is still open for discussion. Like we have seen, the South Sudanese might still have a better chance of finding their way into public school by being like falling under the exception of Sudanese nationals allowing access to public education, but other nationalities are not even included in this list, so their access is even much less likely. We have heard talks about programs that are being planned or in place, or I don't know which status they are at the moment, but they're trying on a way of how to integrate refugee children and asylum seeker children into the public school system. I've heard from UNICEF interviews, there were ideas on working on this area of including them in the national system. But where this stands, we have no information on that. In practice, I think it's still a far, far way, if even possible, for this to work. So this is also why there is no real plan of how somebody who is in a community school for them to later join a public school system. Usually these are just two parallel systems completely separate from each other. You fail to access public school, that's why you go to community schools. We have seen in some interviews, there were some examples, especially from the Syrian communities. I mean, that's a bit far from our research now, but they managed in some cases to access both ways. Like some of them managed to enroll their children in public schools, but also have community schools established. And they actually follow the strategy of sending their children to the public school only once a week, because that allows them to still sit the official government exams, and which gives them certificates that are acknowledged by the state. But they see the community schools as a much better space for learning, to learn more, safer space, better education suiting their needs. So they actually attend on those other 4 days of the week, they go to community schools. Maybe Elena, you have some more insights?
No, I think what Amira said is, I mean, it's correct. They are almost two parallel systems. But as I think Joan mentioned, there's kind of like an absence of the state in a sense, but also the state knows obviously that these community schools are operating. And if something happens amongst the communities that causes strife or issue, then the government will threaten to close the community schools. But they know that they're taking a huge burden also off of the public school system. So this is why we don't see them being closed. Nick, with regard to your question about outreach, I mean, within the realm of our project, we did outreach with people, mainly Egyptians, who are working in, you know, these INGOs, NGOs, lawyers, practitioners, etc. The schools themselves don't do outreach necessarily. They kind of keep to themselves, I would say, in more of a bubble, just because for them that's more safe, and you know, they know what their situation is like outside of the community school with the host community in general. Of course, not everyone, but that the issues that they face and that are raised. So they see really no need, I think, to try and do an outreach component, because I don't think they see anything positive that would honestly come out of it. It would probably just cause more issue. And to go to also Jane Mary's question, thank you for that as well. I think, as Amira said, these are, you know, two separate systems, and some communities will register in the public schools but go to the community schools. But also we see that, you know, organizations like UNHCR, like Catholic Relief Services, offer at least a small stipend to pay the tuition of the community schools. So these organizations also see, I think, the benefits of the community schools and the burden they're taking off of the government by providing these fellowships or stipends, whatever we want to call them. And, you know, they receive no pushback from the government on this. So I think, you know, in general, everyone sees the benefit of these community schools, but they stop at the fact of officially recognizing them and putting them under kind of the umbrella of the government. So thank you for your questions.
Thank you both. Thanks, Elena and Amira. And again, as you say, you know, this linking back to kind of parallel systems and absence of the state. We've got time, I think, we're running a bit short on time, but there's a question for Jane Marie and then one for Tamuka. So I'm going to ask the two questions now and give each of you a couple of minutes to respond. Jane Marie, there's a question here that's asking about what, you know, you were speaking a lot about, obviously, this importance of social networks and connections that took very different forms. But what happens if people fall out of the network? How do individuals then live the city? And so, you know, just sort of how that might work, and whether you came across examples of that in your work. And then Tamuka, a question, I hope I'm interpreting the question correctly, but the experiences of migrants and refugees and sort of the differences that you saw in your different cases and in your work. And so Kuda's got a question here about what makes those experiences different. And so it'd be good to get your reflections on that. So we'll start with Jane Marie, over to you, and then we'll follow up with Tamuka.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Tamuka, for your question. Yeah, we have come across those cases both during this study, but also in our day-to-day work as an organization. So partnerships would just collapse because one part, in many cases, the Tanzanian part will not honor their part of the bargain. We have had cases where people who were employed by Tanzanians go without wages, and when it becomes too much, the Tanzanians will just fire them and not pay them. So there are those cases. In many cases, unfortunately, refugees will just let it go unless it is extremely serious. We have had a case, a very unfortunate one, and this is from our work, not from the research, where a child of a refugee was raped by the neighbor, and this family was not ready to go to report the incident to the police. They just moved away. They came to us to seek legal assistance. We advised them that the first step is to report, and they weren't willing to do that. So there are those situations, and unfortunately, those are some of the downside of these informal relationships that are formed. Yeah, so if I could connect with what you also asked when you are making a sum up of what I said regarding these living in hiding vis-a-vis having these networks. Who are these people who are supporting refugees, registering their SIM cards and so on and so forth. So they're different people. In other cases, the refugees would form these relations with Tanzanians without disclosing that they are refugees. They would disclose that they are Congolese, but they wouldn't say that they are refugees. And it's funny that that makes a huge difference. When you say you are Congolese, you fight fine, you're papa, and people like you. When you say you are a refugee, then depending on how much their knowledge of refugee is, they may discriminate you. But the Good Samaritan that I didn't elaborate more is from the Bible, where someone that would help another person who was not related to him in any way. So there are these people who, after hearing their stories as refugees, they feel obliged because of their religion or their moral, they feel like they have a moral obligation to help them. So there are those kind of people as well. So it's, and sometimes even without disclosing that they're refugees or Congolese, they can get people to register SIM cards for them, for example, because even some Tanzanians are not able to register their SIM cards because they don't have national ID yet, and they use other Tanzanians to do that. Again, sometimes when you have someone registering your SIM card in their name, in case you need to take money, if you have someone has sent you money, sometimes they demand that you give them some of the money and so on. So that it's a mixture of so many things. And regarding going back, the networks to and from camps, yes, they do happen sometimes, depending on the status of the person in Dar es Salaam. Some people would leave their families in the camps and come here as the head of family to just look for jobs. And these would go regularly to visit families, but also to make sure they don't miss the verification exercises and so on and so forth. Let me stop there and let others continue.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jane Marie, and for sort of elaborating on that. We're sort of at time. So Tamuka, would you like to reflect on the question from Kuda? And I think really his question is about what is the difference between individuals who are referred to as refugees versus those who are referred to as migrants? You know, are they experiencing the same things within the context of your research in Belleville? So I'm not sure if you want to take a minute just to reflect on that at all.
Thank you very much, Jo, and thank you very much, Kuda, for asking this question. It's a very difficult question, but in my own understanding and from what I gathered during my research is that their experiences are very similar, but they are not the same, in a way that, you know, the way in which the refugees defined in South Africa, you know, gives refugees a certain level of expectations. They expect to be treated in a certain way, right? And also the way in which, for example, Zimbabweans are not qualified as refugees. You know, they've come to terms with their status. But the main difference comes in when I was talking about visibility and invisibility. A refugee knows when to become a refugee if it benefits them, and also a migrant would know when to become a migrant. In those situations, I think their experiences differ in a way that when migrants, you know, are gathered as migrants, or when migrants are interacting as migrants, it's different from when refugees are interacting as refugees. And also the way that they interact with the state is different, and also the way that they are treated with the state is different. So in that way, I think that's when I saw the differences in their experiences, but in most cases their experiences are similar. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tamuka. And I think, you know, this also links to, you know, the point that was made, I think it was knowledge, you know, about the fact that everyone in a country will often experience similar things, and then there are particularities to particular groups. Knowledge, I see your hands up, but I'm afraid we're going to have to end there. I know that the closing session starts at 25 past. So please do join the closing session. And just to say from my side, just to close, this has been a fantastic panel, and thank you all for such clear and detailed presentations, for keeping to time, for a great conversation. I see there's already a request about Jane Marie for your paper. And I think that obviously the recordings will also be available. So please do reach out. And if people are happy, we will obviously be able to share presentations and things like that for those that want, but keep an eye on the website for the recordings. Yeah, so thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening, and take care and stay safe. Thank you. Bye.